Right. Well, I think I'm right in saying, having read Gareth and his team's excellent report as usual, that you're committed to a cap of 45 billion plus RPI or CPI. I wasn't quite clear on which of those it is.
It's a GDP deflator.
GDP deflator. Right. Okay. So, I mean, I then read in the report little heffalump traps in here in sort of figure 9 on page 36. I read previous programmes have lacked budget discipline with expectations that budgets could be increased. The programme team should draw out lessons on cost efficiency mechanisms used in other programmes. I also find on page 22, under 1.10 and 1.12, that there are suggestions that mayoral combined authorities have found it very difficult to follow what the DFT is doing. Now, I think the committee wants to know that we're not going to see further cost overruns, and having made this commitment, how are you, given these issues here, how are you going to guarantee to the committee and to the taxpayer that you're not going to overrun again? Because there does seem to be some sort of suggestion that, as the state usually does, it takes for granted the fact that there is no real budget for them.
Let me start, and then colleagues will add. If I just take that point about the engagement with mayoral strategic authorities over the last 2 years, we absolutely recognise the point the National Audit Office made, what they had heard. We had 18 months as we were supporting the government to develop their plans for Northern Powerhouse Rail, where, you will appreciate there was, a limit to what we could do with local partners. Say making progress on specific elements of the programme, like I think good progress and good engagement at Bradford Station. I think as Tom described, the work that led up, and you see in those compacts that were signed, I think show we already sort of have moved beyond that, and that is the way we will continue the programme. As we've said, the 45 billion is a cap, is not a cost estimate. And as Nick said, very deliberately learning lessons of the past to be clear about outcomes rather than specific inputs or outputs that must be delivered for that funding, precisely to recognise that at this very, very early stage, cost estimates are, will be very immature, and we will learn more as we go through. And that is the way we ensure that we don't repeat the lessons that the Chair described of HS2 cost estimation over the last decade. But I don't know.
Because clearly, I mean, up north, and it is a very important rail link, this sort of across the north. Yeah. I think it was more important in my view than the HS2 sort of heffalump trap and sort of vanity project. But as you're aware, and when I built the Southampton Stadium, local politics played a huge part in actually crabbing logic. You have local councils, some who are Labour, some who are Tory, some who are Lib Dem. They all find it hard to agree that water is wet, and very often logic doesn't happen. Now, up north, you've also got the historic rivalry between sort of east and west, from quite long historical issues. So is that going to knock you off course, do you think, or are you able to give us assurance that you've got that all covered?
I mean, as Tom said before, do we think this is going to be a sort of a perfect walk in the park with complete consensus at every stage? Of course we don't. What we are going to be guided by, and we are committed to, is transparency in cost estimation, transparency in analysis, so that all parties are able to see and take a view on the best and the same information.
And I think within that, because actually the piece you read out on financial management was our reflection on lessons learned, in fact, and the things that we want to address. But we will definitely be looking very hard at benchmarking and at the comparisons with schemes that have gone. I think within that there is always a tension and a judgment to go through. We both need to be cognizant of what HS2 Phase 1 is turning out to cost. We also need to be clear that that is not the design, construction and commercial construct that we wish to repeat. And therefore there needs to be enough pressure in the system to do better than that, but there also needs to be, not in so much delusion that there is a repeat of history in the way that the Chair described, and that's what we will be looking at as we go forwards. I think then within the northern dimension as you described, our intent we talked about earlier, is to get to the position where there is an indicative funding envelope for both Phase 1 and Phase 2. Those can largely then be managed as separate projects each side of the Pennines. At the point where either of them is asking for more money, then actually that is coming up to the overall governance through the groups that Tom runs, and for transparency for everybody, because as I think we were discussing earlier, the implications of raising that will be that there is less left to do other things unless there are offsetting local contributions coming forward.
Okay. Well, you're probably aware also, next question from me, I've got two more, is that construction costs, and I run construction businesses, have historically outstripped any form of inflation yardstick. Most government inflation yardsticks understate inflation, and particularly building cost inflation, which has gone up and is likely to continue to go up. So does that worry you?
I think we've set out with Treasury colleagues how we expect the 45 to be uprated over time. I think equally the translation of that into budgets is done at individual spending reviews, and those decisions are taken then. And I wouldn't wish to sort of prejudge the future, but if you think back to the sort of numbers that were being seen at COVID, in terms of the inflation that was rife through the supply chain as a whole, then those are the sorts of things that government has to reconsider. But 45 is the number.
I think it goes back to the discussion earlier about the phasing of this work and the supply chain, because we are all obviously architects as well in the costs to industry. Before the National Infrastructure Commission became part of NISTA, they did some interesting analysis on rail electrification, and they compared, the German rail electrification programme, which had been very consistent over a number of years, and ours, which had been, gone up and down. That adds costs to industry. So therefore, a lot of the work we are doing here is about showing that the pipeline of work and making sure it is phased such that we can do what we can to reduce the cost or minimise the cost of construction.
Okay, well, thank you. And lastly, I think I'm right in saying, and I think this is probably for you, Joe, this question. I think I'm right in saying that you've basically committed to undertake a review of the rail infrastructure costs, which we haven't yet seen. Is that right?
That is right. Nick will be able to give you more detail on it, but that is absolutely right. Okay,
so if I could just carry on, because I smelt what I consider to possibly be a wolf in sheep's clothing when I read more deeply. And, on the face of it, it sounds good. The idea is to improve transport from east to west in the north, which you think is the objective, so that people can get from one side of the country to another in a better, more efficient and more timely way. Now that on the face of it sounds good, and we talk about, Northern Powerhouse, we talk about, growth strategies, we talk about all things that make sense. But then I read, first of all, this issue of ministerial intervention causing delay, and then I read what the Secretary of State says. I think we need to start thinking about transport as a public health intervention as much as an intervention that can stimulate economic growth. So I read that, and I also, so Joe, I've seen comments from you, I think, saying, you talk about a plan to drive cultural change, to create healthier communities, to densify, or as I say, cram people into, more dense population around transit routes. And I start to think this is arguably statist intervention rather than actually allowing individuals to travel east-west unfettered in a more effective way so they can pursue their own lives. So is the reason you've delayed this costing because you are embedding other, what I would describe as unacceptable additives into this plan?
So Nick can come back in a second with details of that review, but I'd say the answer is absolutely not. I confess, I apologise, I don't know where those words from the Secretary of State come from. I suspect
they're quote from her in 25.
Right. So I suspect...
Direct quote.
I suspect that was Secretary of State thinking about the work we've done, for instance, recently on Better Connected, how we enable local leaders to make the right integrated transport planning for their own particular communities, rather than this question of how we join cities together through major rail. It is, a strong view of the government that having and supporting local leaders to have the right transport infrastructure for their cities, their regions, their towns and villages is an economic benefit. It is also a health benefit in terms of air quality, or supporting people to stay independent, longer into their lives, which is obviously an increasing issue for us. So I suspect, I suspect it was with that in mind.
Climate change agenda driving things rather than.
I suspect it was with that in mind, and that sort of transport within cities, towns, and villages the Secretary of State was talking about. I don't know, Nick, if you can say more about the infrastructure costing.
I think just one more on that one. I think, and it actually goes to the questions that Anna Dixon was asking earlier about how we would value social outcomes in the way that we're working very collaboratively with Will and colleagues and with the council at Bradford. And we are definitely looking at the health benefits that come both from the transport intervention in itself, but also actually come from reducing the level of worklessness in the population, if you can achieve that. So we're definitely onto that, if that makes sense. And there's a question about what we can quantify and what we can't, but I wouldn't want to lose sight of that. I think in terms of the rail infrastructure cost review, ministers have very clearly said that is something they intend to commission. We are in discussion at the moment in terms of advice around what that might look like and how it might kind of be taken forward. But I think I'm afraid you'll have to wait a little while for that to be formally announced and confirmed.
That won't be out for a bit.
I certainly don't think it will be out before prorogation.
Well, that may happen on Wednesday. That may happen on Wednesday, so that's not far ahead.
Can I just add something to your point about are we sort of packing people in and restricting them? There's no choice for people at the moment in the north for too many people to travel to get work and to get the opportunities that are needed in places like Bradford and travel to Leeds and Manchester. I think the plans that we're proposing around the stations are not to, pack everyone in really, really densely in Leeds. It's very much a use of public space, sort of Scandinavian model more than anything. I think there's really good regeneration happening in the cities of the north. It's about giving those younger people more opportunity to be able to access more jobs and get people to think differently about the sort of the 9 million people or so is about the same as London, but people don't think about that area like they would London. And if we can change that and get investors and graduates and others to think in that way, then that's where I think people, despite the rivalries which still exist, they can sort of see the bigger picture.
Well, I think we'd agree about that, because having run a Premier League football club, I sort of know about the East-West rivalries, particularly the Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds rivalries, which are always very powerful. And I don't think we disagree on what you're saying, but I think we might disagree. I think the job of the government is to actually make the rail links quickly, which they haven't done because it's taken, 10 or 12 years of messing around. And that will then allow people the choice and freedom, as you say, to transfer easily east-west and find work where work actually appears. So I don't think we disagree about that. I think we might disagree philosophically about certain issues that concern me when I read this. So I personally wouldn't want to see this morph into a sort of a social geography project. I think the objective should be to build the rail link. That in itself shouldn't be complicated. Well,
as I said at the start, and Chair, you gave us the time to elaborate, this is based on the Northern growth strategy, the economic analysis of how we can improve these growth corridors. It is our job to deliver that strategic objective that's been set by the government. And
I might just add, to deliver the rail project, but then to integrate it with the local transport and regeneration. Because at the stations we then want access for as many people as possible to be able to use it, and equally at the stations we want to make the best use of the development land that's there.
So no wolves in sheep's clothing today. Geoffrey, over to you.